Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Guess what? We finally get to talk about the LG V30, and I feel like I'm running out of intros for these videos, so I keep saying the same exact thing, but it's not a big deal. We're going to keep rocking with it. Now, the LG V30 came out in 2017, and this is actually a pretty interesting device because for me, the V line series was always kind of like, it wasn't like a gimmicky series, but it was kind of more like just a random thing that LG put out. I don't really know why they even made it. Stemming back to the LG V10, the biggest selling factor of that was pretty much that screen technology up top. Then the V20, which I just reviewed like a couple of days ago, that one also had that secondary screen. However, this one, it really didn't have that secondary screen. It just had one screen on the front, so they took a little bit of a different approach. There were also some other variants of the LG V30. There was like an LG V30 Plus and different things like that, which I don't know if there was a big difference between them. But with the LG V30, this is the one we are going to be talking about today. Now, looking on the front of this phone, you can see that we have a pretty big 6-inch OLED display. This resolution on this panel is 1440p, and it's actually not that bad of a panel. It's actually a very decent panel for this type of phone. Now, when I turned it on for the first time, I was expecting it to be like a little washed out, and it truly was. And I think this has a lot to do with LG's color accuracy thing. I've owned many LG phones. My first main Android phone I used actually was the Nexus 4, which was made by LG, and then I switched to an LG G2. And LG phones throughout time have always been a little washed out for their panels. This one also is kind of the same way, which is interesting because for an OLED display, usually it's not like that, but this one was a little bit like that. I attribute that a lot to LG's UI, which is not my favorite, but it is what it is. Regardless, I think it's still a pretty good display. It has a lot going for it there. Looking on the bottom, you can see we have a USB Type-C port, which is really cool. And on the back, a glass back and a dual camera setup. And right below that is the fingerprint sensor. And what I can tell you about the camera is every time I see a phone that at least has a dual camera setup, that really does future-proof it quite a bit. Even if it's like a secondary lens is like a 3-megapixel camera or something like that. I think it's like the LG G5 has some setup like that. They're like the secondary lens is smaller resolution and a lower megapixel count than the main camera. But I still think as long as you have a dual camera setup at the minimum, you're still kind of future-proofing yourself in 2020. So in terms of that and in terms of the outside, you're pretty much set. And this phone also has IP68 dust or water resistance, which is really cool. But it also has the MIL STD 801G compliance, whatever, the same thing the S8 Active had. I think the S9 Active, I don't know, I don't think there was an S9 Active, but I saw some reports that there were, whatever. But the same thing that the S8 Active has, which is really cool, and I really do like that a lot. So that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the outside. Now, hitting on the software, this thing was released with Android 7.1.2 Nougat. We are able to upgrade it to Android 9.0 Pie, and in terms of software, I want to say that's pretty much it. I don't think it's going to be getting another version of software, which is not that big of a deal because Android Pie, in my opinion, is pretty decent, and we're kind of set to know that the LG line of phones aren't necessarily the best phones to get software all the time. They're kind of like in the back end a lot of times, and we look at phone manufacturers like Samsung. Those are the guys that we look at and we're like, oh, push the next update, this and that. But in the LG line, I mean, we really don't have a lot of phones that, first of all, last super long, but second of all, really don't last that long in terms of software either. When I had my LG G2, I kind of wanted stock software support at the time, and they were not supporting it, and that was kind of sad. And I eventually actually had to custom ROM my phone and root it, and I ended up rocking a custom ROM with it for a while, and that's a huge testament, I think, to the development community more so than just LG's community. Now, in terms of software, like longevity, that's pretty much that. But the thing I dislike, and it just seems like I'm bashing on this phone, and I'm really not trying to do that, but the one thing I dislike the most about this phone for sure would definitely be the software. The UI on this phone is not my favorite. I think it's one of the weirdest UIs ever. I never liked it, even stemming from like the G5's UI, even like the G3's. I think the G3's look nice, but the G4's UI even, it just doesn't look that good. It just looks so childish and weird. This one looks a little bit more professional, but I still don't know what they're trying to get at. It's just kind of like a weird thing they're doing, and I hope with these next couple versions of software, they really take their time and try to make it more minimal. If they can make it more like OnePlus's UI or even any of these companies' UI, I think that would be a great service to this phone. And we've seen that LG actually put out a statement or whatever that, they want to make a profit this year. They haven't been making profits for a while. And I'm telling you guys, I know that nobody from their company watches my videos, but if they actually go and start making their software better, their hardware is good. Like when you feel this phone, it still feels like a pretty good phone, but the software is what's lacking. And if they can go focus and fix the software aspect of it, I think they could definitely have a killer phone on their hands. device. You look at a phone manufacturer like OnePlus, their hardware is pretty decent. They were rocking 1080p displays for a long time. It's not like they were like a killer phone manufacturer, but their software was really good, and that's what sold the phone. The same thing with the Pixel line. LG can become those guys if they just focus on the software. But like I said, there's always roots and custom ROMs out for this thing. So even though this thing is not supported anymore, you can always go and custom ROM it if you have that capability. So that pretty much covers it up in the software standpoint. Now hitting on the performance, this thing was released with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 835 chipset, an octa-core CPU, an Adreno 540 GPU, and apparently there were 2 SD card slots on this thing, which I just realized. Maybe so, maybe not, or maybe if you have a dual SIM model you can have that capability. But there were 2 different models of the LG V30, a 64 and 128 gigabyte model, and both those models had 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now what I can tell you about the performance standpoint is it's not a bad performing device at all. I think it's actually pretty decent. It's kind of on par with the Galaxy S8, which is pretty interesting. I wasn't expecting it to be like that, but they both had the same chipset, I believe. But with the LG V30, it's more or less kind of what you expect. It's about a 3-year-old phone this year, so you kind of see like it's kind of aging a little bit, but I think it can still handle majority of things that you throw at it. Luckily, like I said, it is on Android Pie, so it's not like on a super old version of software. So really whatever you're going to do with it is going to be perfectly fine. In my case, when I actually went and used it, it was actually pretty smooth for the most part. There were some cases where I could see like it kind of glitching up a little bit or stuttering, but I attribute that a lot more to the fact that the software on this thing is really weird versus the phone's hardware, because the hardware is pretty capable, but the software I think is, with the amount of background processes LG's UI has and everything, I think the software was one of the things that kind of threw me off a little bit. But in terms of the hardware and the actual performance of this phone, I think it's actually pretty decent. The only thing other than the software and the background processes, maybe the RAM is, we have phones that have like 6 to 8 gigabytes of RAM at the minimum now, and 4 gigabytes of RAM really won't do you too well in the long run. I think it's a pretty good performing phone, but the RAM management side is probably one of the things that kind of throw me off, and keeping apps in the background and everything aren't necessarily the best. When you have more and more RAM, it can definitely do you better, and especially on a skinned version of Android like this with a lot of bloatware sometimes, it's definitely not a good mixture of having low RAM and also a really weird software. So I think that really pretty much covers it up in terms of the performance standpoint. I think it's still a pretty good performing phone still, so I think that's a pro for sure. Now hitting on the camera, this thing, like I said, has a dual camera setup, which I really like, a 16 megapixel standard lens and a 13 megapixel ultra wide sensor. And on the front we have a 5 megapixel 1080p camera, which I don't know why they equipped this camera with a 5 megapixel front facing camera. They should have done a way better job at that front camera, because the back camera is actually not bad, but that front camera is not so good. But on that back camera we can shoot 4K at 30 frames, 1080p at 60 frames, which is surprising. I would expect to see at least like 1080p at 120, but whatever. But I think the camera of this phone is still an asset for sure. Whenever I was using it at the time, it's not like I use it every day, but when I was using it at the time, I was seeing that the colors were good, the lighting first of all was good, so like all the photos were going to look good, but it was a pretty good camera at the end of the day. There were a lot of features built into the camera UI as well. I think though the camera UI is a little bit glitchy, which is funny because this phone is more than capable of running a camera app. But sometimes there were times where it kind of glitch up a little bit. It's not a big deal. You're taking a photo and you're moving on with your day. But that was one thing that I saw for sure. So I think in terms of the camera, it's definitely a thumbs up. It has a lot going for it. And like I said, as long as you have a dual camera setup in 2020, you're pretty much set for the most part. There will be times where it's going to be a little weird and this and that, but I think this camera still has a thumbs up in my books for sure. So that pretty much covers that. Now hitting on the battery life, this thing has a non-removable 3300 milliamp hour battery, and I think the battery life is pretty okay on this device. It's not like it's a crazily huge amazing battery. It's not like it's a 5000 or 4000 milliamp hour battery. It's a 3300 milliamp hour battery, and with that huge screen with that big resolution, you'll definitely be able to see that it can be a little weird at times. And also you have the software in there that kind of is a little bogged down sometimes. So in my opinion, I want to say this battery life is a little bit below average. Another thing to keep in mind is that this thing, because it was 3 years old at this time, it's going to be 3 years old this year, the battery has degraded quite a bit. So it's not at that full 3300, it's probably at like 2900 or maybe even less than that. It's not a crazy big deal. It's not like something that's you're gonna cry about, but it is something to keep in mind. When you get this phone, or when you even look at this phone, that's one thing to keep in the back of your head, that the battery life is probably not the best, and it will never be the best, but it's definitely a little bit below average for sure. So to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, is the LG V30 still worth it in 2020? What I can tell you is that I think this phone is still worth it in 2020 for a select few, okay? The body still holds up, the screen is still amazing, the software is really the main thing that's lacking. Even the performance, the camera, all battery life, I can probably get by with those things, but the software is one of the things that for a majority of you, for me, I know I would custom ROM it, but for a majority of you, I don't think you would. And I think that's probably the biggest problem with this phone, is the software. And that's the one thing you're interacting with every day. As long as the screen's good, then you're okay. But the software is definitely not my favorite. It might be your favorite, but for me, it's not. So if you can get over that software limitations, you can get over that software thing, then yeah, 100%. I think it's completely worth it to those of you who want it. But just know this thing is not getting software updates anymore. It's outdated in terms of that. There's definitely better phones you can get out for the market, but this phone is costing about $170, which is a pretty good price. I will tell you, if you don't want to go for the V30, I would recommend getting a Galaxy S8. I think those phones are killer. Those have a lot more going for it in a lot of ways. And that phone is still getting security updates for a minute too. So that really pretty much covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much. But definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count. So it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel. All those things are linked down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys could check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.